Welcome or welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by ARCAT. This is a show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is Andrew Smith, AIA, APT, RP, Principal and Historical Architect at Hennebery Eddy Architects, right here in my hometown of Portland, Oregon. Andrew is an historical architect and seasoned project manager with more than 30 years of experience in the planning, design execution, and administration of both new construction and rehabilitation projects. His expertise includes directing project teams in finding sensitive and appropriate design solutions when historic and cultural resources are involved, including several projects for the National Park Service. At Hennebery Eddy, Andrew is a principal and leader in the firm's Historic Resources Group, serving federal, state, and private clients in the thoughtful assessment, rehabilitation, and stewardship planning of historic structures. The project we are talking about today is the Oregon Supreme Court Interior Modernization and Seismic Retrofit in Salem, Oregon. The rehabilitation of the Oregon Supreme Court building stands as a model for how historic preservation and forward-looking resilience can coexist within a single architectural vision. A triple-friction-pendulum base isolation system was inserted beneath the building, effectively decoupling superstructure from ground motion. This move transforms the foundation into a dynamic interface. In a Cascadia Subduction Zone event, the ground may oscillate laterally up to 2 feet while the building above remains comparatively stable. Now, let's get into the details. My guest today is Andrew Smith, AIA, APT, RP, which I'm going to have to find out what that means, Principal and Historical Architect at Hennebery Eddy Architects here in my hometown of Portland, Oregon. The project we're chatting about today is the beautiful Oregon Supreme Court Interior Modernization and Seismic Retrofit in Salem, Oregon, which is about an hour down the road from us here in Portland. Andrew, welcome to Detailed. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, I'm thrilled. Well, obviously, I have a big soft spot in my heart for Hennebery Eddy because, number one, it's a local firm. Number two, I have friends that work there, and you guys do great projects. So I'm really honored to have you on the show today. We always start off with an icebreaker question. I just make them up depending on who I'm talking to and what they do, or whether I'm like, what animal would you be if you could? It's all over the place, but for you, after reading your bio, you've taken a big, obviously, huge interest in historical projects in particular. And so I'm just curious, what inspired you to take a specific interest? Those are not the easiest projects to do. I know I've worked on them in the past. What inspired you to venture down that path?
Well, this may not sound like an obvious start to an answer to that question, but I come from a family of scientists. My parents were both chemists. My brother is a chemical engineer. So that ruled out science for me. I was going to go do something entirely different than my family. But my dad, before he became a chemistry major, was a history major. And I think I inherited sort of a love of history from him. So I went to architecture school in New Orleans at Tulane School of Architecture. And New Orleans was a wonderful sort of laboratory for historic architecture, and doing student projects in New Orleans was really pretty formative for me. So then my first job was in Chicago, right in the Loop. And the project I worked on my first year and a half out of school was rehabilitating all of the Daniel Burnham plan precast throughout Grant Park, and our office overlooked Grant Park. And I didn't go to architecture school to begin with to do historic work, but after that project, I was kind of hooked, and I really have not looked back. I've my 31 years of doing this, it's mostly been centered on historic work.
Well, you're certainly never going to get bored doing historic work because you never know what you're gonna get, and it's funny, I can relate to that story. I have one of my kids, my youngest son, um, is a scientist as well,
Ooh,
microbiology and chemistry, and I don't get it either. It's he would come home, from college during breaks and talk about some of the things he was doing, and I would just be like, "You're so far over my head." I really, truly I love that you're so passionate, and go ahead and keep talking for 2 hours, but I just want you to know I don't understand
yeah,
understand a darn thing.
I'm
It's
not
like
tracking with you at
yeah,
all, right?
not tracking it all. I'm probably zoned out and not even hearing half of it. Well, let's talk about this project. Let's start with a little background or history on the Oregon Supreme Court building.
Okay. Well, it was built in 1914, and it is actually the oldest building on the Capitol Mall in Salem, which I don't think a lot of people realize since it's barely over a 100-year-old building, but it is the oldest one. It was designed by William Christmas Knighton, and he was actually the first and only state architect of the state of Oregon, and from 1911 to 1915. So he didn't do all that many projects while he was the state architect. But this was, I think, one of his best works, one of the highest profile projects that he did. Besides the Supreme Court, which it was obviously designed for, it was also designed to house the um, the state law library and actually the state library of Oregon, and those functions have been housed in the Capitol building up until that point. So they moved into the Supreme Court building when it opened in 1914, and it's a good thing because that Capitol building burned to the ground in 1936. So imagine the law library and the state library having lost all of having lost all of that content, all those volumes, if it had been burned in that fire. So that was fortunate, and that's what brought about the Art Deco style capital that we know today in Oregon. Um, and those the state library eventually moved out of the building, but the building has, since it opened in 1914, has housed the Supreme Court and the law library.
I hadn't thought to ask this question, but were there many some of these buildings that are 100 years old end up being 100 years later this patchwork of renovations and additions that happen over the years that make it even more difficult to work with. Did this building have much work done to it, between then and this project?
Um, For as old as it is, remarkably little. There were spaces in the building which had modern interventions in them, but fortunately, those were the um, more ancillary spaces. Office areas and things of that sort. They've had drop ceilings and more contemporary finishes put in them. But the really important places within this Supreme Court building, I think there's been a healthy respect for along the way. And so those spaces have actually been very well preserved.
That's nice to hear. It really is because so often they cover up everything that's beautiful about a building as they do that over the years. So tell me, fast forward to now, what were the client's needs and goals for this project? We've got this building that hasn't been too terribly messed with over the years. What did they need to happen now for this project?
In addition to being used by the Supreme Court, the building's also used by the State Court of Appeals. And the courts are really an important institution in our state, right? They need to be able to function regardless of what's happening in the outside world. And actually, maybe better put, they need to be able to function um, because of what's happening in the outside world, right? So, the primary goals of the court were really seismic resilience, energy and water efficient systems, occupant comfort, and through all that, really protecting and continuing to protect and preserve the historic character the building that makes it so special.
When I was reading through some of the materials that you sent me and doing my own research online, one of the things that kind of jumped off the page, I've been around. I've been working in Portland for more years than I'm going to admit to. I say that all the time. I'm not telling you how long. Um, and I've done probably throughout the course of my career every type of project at one point or another. Um, it really stood out to me that there seemed to be a a lot more pre-design investigations than I'm typically used to seeing on a project, um, that had to happen before you could really get started on this project. Tell me a little bit about that and why these all these different investigations were important.
Yeah, I mean, for a project of this type specifically, like, you need to know what you're dealing with, right? Like, if you don't understand the patient, you can't treat the patient, to put it in sort of the medical analogy. So, from some of the historic documentation we had, we knew generally what the building structure was. We knew generally what was inside of the walls. But, in order to design a building to be seismically resilient, we needed to know precisely what was there, because the forces that are involved require specificity, right, in order to design um, the interventions. So, for example, um, we knew from the drawings that the structure of the building were built up steel columns. And by built up, I mean they weren't rolled as one piece. They were several pieces of steel that were riveted together. And so we needed to expose some of those so that we could document specifically what was there. How thick of a steel plate made up the flange or made up the web? What types of shapes were there? How many rivets? How far spaced apart? Because those things all point towards how it will perform under loading. So it's really important to have that data before you start. Other things we did in a similar vein were brick pull tests to sort of determine how mortar joints between the brick in the unreinforced masonry walls, how much force they would be able to withstand before they started to slide apart. Um, we also did floor cores to understand sort of the thickness and the makeup of the floor assemblies, again, to see how they would react to seismic loading. So um, those were the primary ones that we did, but it was a prolonged preliminary phase because we really did need to understand the patient.
So for our listeners, since I just looked at the stats the other day, we have listeners in 200 countries now, which
Wow,
is pretty cool. For our
sweet.
listeners who are not familiar with the Portland area, the entire West Coast is on a fault line. So
Mhm.
seismics, if you're wondering why we're talking more about seismic when we're talking about this building as I might in another building, it's because we're all sitting on a fault line, and one of these days, we're probably gonna have a big earthquake. So it's a really important thing in this area to consider, especially on these old buildings. I worked in a building at the start of my career in downtown Portland for 22 years that was in one of the old brick buildings in Old Town.
Mm.
And our structural engineer used to tell me all the time, "Cherise, if the ground shakes even a little bit, don't even grab your purse, run out the door because this whole
Yeah.
building's coming down
Yep.
if the ground shakes." So, it's an important thing around here, and one of the reasons we're focusing on it a little bit more in this interview. Um, so I've worked on historic projects in the past, and working with the authorities having jurisdiction on historic projects can often add additional time and approval layers before you can do what you want to do, to a building, historic preservation committees or whoever it is that is governing over that particular building. How did that process look like because isn't even just a historic building. This is a very important historic building. I mean, they're all important, but, some are more notable than others. Um, how did that process go on this project?
Yeah, I think the key to success on, like, as you mentioned, on projects like this is just to have early conversations. Applying building codes to new buildings is complex, but it's relatively straightforward, right? You're generating everything that's going to be there. Um, with existing buildings, it gets a little bit more complicated because there are always aspects of those existing buildings that aren't code compliant. And what do you do about those deficiencies, right? Because with historic buildings, it adds a whole nother wrinkle to it because there are character defining features about that building that can't be heavily modified or removed or, what have you. So, the key to it with this building was some early conversation with a lot of projects like this, early conversations, and then some creativity early on about, um, well, we need to address this. We're not going to be able to do it in a certain way, in certain ways because of the historic character. What are some creative solutions to accomplishing what we call an equivalency that sort of still meets the intent of the code? On the historic side, we have a very good relationship with the State Historic Preservation Office and other, historic agencies. So same thing, early discussions. I think to the extent that they can know what the issues are and know what's coming, I think it helps everyone to sort of be prepared for um, what those trade-offs might be and what those equivalencies might wind up being.
Well, and it really it communication and relationships are 2 things we just don't talk about enough and focus on enough in an industry where we have to do everything as a team. Um, and especially on work like this, I've been involved in a project where they just showed up with this design, completed design to the Historic Preservation Committee, and then you just watch their heads spin around on their neck like, "Whoa, wait a minute." That's like one of the worst things you can do on a project like this is not come in real early and establish those relationships and keep them in the loop. I think sometimes people just feel like, why was I left out of this? And that almost creates a different environment that's not as conducive to getting the project done.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
great
Uh,
piece of advice.
Mm. Well, I should note too that for the last 7 years, I've sat on the Portland Historic Landmarks Commission. I'm currently the chair of the commission, and so I get to see it from the other side as well. I get to, you know, see projects come in that for land use, zoning approval, and I think the same thing holds true. We have design advice request meetings where teams can get in front of the commission early on and talk about where they are with the project, what a couple of major alternatives might be, and get feedback on which one of those might set the project up better for an approval down the road. So all reinforces the same point.
Well, I love that you said that because I do a lot of mentoring of younger professionals and I teach the CDT certification program. And one of the things I probably say ad nauseum, they're probably sick of hearing me, is get out of your box. I know that after 22 years of working in architecture, after 2008, our firm closed down completely. I went to work for MEP engineers.
Mm.
And it completely changed everything for me as a spec writer, and all the things I used to complain about the engineers and their documents were actually my fault. But I didn't know that till I had to sit on the other side of the fence. And then I went back to architecture for a long time, and now I'm in building science, but it was a defining moment in my career to understand how the other half lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
That's a great point.
And I have a completely different lens, and I think I do a lot better work these days. Um, I wish I just would have had that experience sooner, understood. I also did a short stint in construction, which also changed a lot. It really you being on that committee and having to sit on both sides of that table has to have completely changed the way that you approached a project once you had to sit on the other side of the table.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's cross-training, right? That's what I think
yeah,
about it as just being cross-training.
and invaluable.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so it's not too terribly often these days that I hear terminology in our industry that I've never heard before. Even if I don't understand it, I've heard it, right? Until I get your project description. I'm like, oh, here's one that's going to teach me something. So we were just talking about how earthquakes are a big deal along the West Coast, and especially here in Portland. And we have to consider that in our designs. In your project description, you mentioned, quote, I'm going to say quote because I'd never heard of this before, triple friction pendulum base isolation system. Please enlighten me. What is that?
Yeah,
What does that mean? And tell me a little bit about the seismic retrofit components that you designed for this project.
sure. Well, in full disclosure, I had never heard of it before this project either, so I learned
Yes.
something.
That makes me feel better. It really
Yeah.
does.
So yeah, just to reference back to your mention of the Cascadia Subduction Zone, I think it's important for the listeners to kind of understand what that means and how it's different from other seismic zones. Um, so the Cascadia Subduction Zone is out several miles offshore, out underneath the Pacific Ocean, where the Juan de Fuca plate under the ocean actually subducts beneath the North American plate, and that's very different from down in California, the San Andreas Fault, which actually is just an extension of the subduction zone offshore of us. It's on land, and it actually it's a fault line where the plates sort of slide past each other in a horizontal fashion. The subduction zone up here is where a plate's running underneath, and what happens as the plate runs underneath is the plates bind themselves together, and over time, decades, centuries, that those forces build and build and build until eventually something happens to make them break free and they slip. And we don't get a lot of seismic activity here in the Pacific Northwest, but when we do, it's the big one. Or there are other smaller incidents, but they're not nearly as frequent as they are, say, in California and other places. So what all that means for us as architects is uh, we've got a design basically for an 8 to 9 magnitude earthquake, even though they don't happen but every 3, 4, 500 years. Um, the last documented one was in the year 1700, so that was 326 years ago. So we've entered the sort of the danger zone, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. So when we look at modernizing historic buildings, this is something we have to wrestle with. It makes no sense to reinvest tens of millions of dollars into um, a historic resource without preparing it for that event. So there are really two different primary types of seismic rehabilitation, and I'm not a structural engineer. I'm like doing my best to play structural engineer when I talk about this stuff. But one is fixed base, and that means that the building's connected to the ground, and you're acknowledging that as the ground starts to shake sideways, the building is going to start to shake, and you're doing things to the superstructure of the building to resist those forces, right? There's a whole separate approach, which is called base isolation. And what that means is that you're essentially decoupling the building from the ground so that when the ground starts shaking violently, the building is starts to sort of drift around, but in a very much more sort of dampened kind of way. And the the element that allows the building to stand on its foundation, but also be decoupled from the ground, is a base isolator. And in this case, we wound up using a triple-friction-pendulum isolator, which is just a variety of a base isolator. But essentially, it's sort of two inverted cups, and inside of them are another pair of smaller cups, and um, and a core element, a hard core. And as the ground begins to move, these cups sort of ride up on each other, and but the more they ride towards the edge, the more the gravity, the mass of the building works against that movement because it's trying to lift the building up. So it ever increases the level of friction inside of that base isolator. And so because it's a multi-piece element and it operates on friction that's generated by the movement of it trying to push up and the weight of the building trying to push down, you get the name Triple-Friction-Pendulum isolator.
Okay. It sounds a little bit like the building's log rolling on this thing moving back
Yeah.
and forth.
Right. Yeah. It's sort of like, yeah, it's like it's kind of like a mechanical piece of mechanical equipment sitting on a damper, right? Like the mechanical equipment's vibrating and this damper sort of decoupling it from the structure so that the structure doesn't also vibrate. I kind of think of it as being somewhat similar to that.
Well, now I learned something new. So the Oregon Supreme Court is one of only two historic LEED Gold certified base isolated buildings in the nation, and the very first in Oregon. What kinds of things did you have to do to this project to reach that LEED Gold goal?
Mhm. I I will clarify that statement to say that at the time that the project concluded, that was the case. There may be others by the time of this production of this podcast, but um, the the biggest thing really is that we retained the building and didn't demolish it and replace it with a new Supreme Court building, right? Like so, like starting at the top of that sort of pyramid, when you retain the vast majority of the structure and enclosure and interior components of a building, you're really retaining all of that embodied carbon. And rather than, you know, taking it to the landfill and expending all that much more carbon in the mining, manufacture, delivery, and assembly of a new building. So that's really the big thing. Other factors, we installed energy efficient HVAC systems, low flow plumbing fixtures. Um, all of the lighting in the building was retrofit with LED lamps. And some of those drop ceilings that I mentioned before that happened from later construction, a lot of those were removed and ceilings were sort of raised back to closer to their historic heights so that much more natural daylighting um, comes in. So even though you have efficient LED lighting, sometimes you don't necessarily even need to have it on because we've increased the amount of natural daylight.
You talked a little bit in your project description about some of the reductions you achieved, actual, like, real numbers that you achieved with these sustainability measures. Can you share a few of those with us?
Sure. I'm going to refer to my notes
That's
because
okay.
numbers, right?
Yeah,
uh,
exactly.
uh, so the new heating and cooling systems achieve nearly a 25% reduction in energy use, a 35% reduction in water usage. And overall, there's a metric called the PEUI, the predicted energy use intensity, which just tries to aggregate all of sort of like the per square foot reduction in energy usage. Um, so we had an EUI of um, about 59% energy use reduction as compared to the AIA 2030 baseline building. So a significant reduction. It's not a net zero building, but I think for what it is, I think we achieve some meaningful energy and water reduction as part of it.
59 in my opinion, 59% on a historic building is incredible.
Yeah,
Um,
if we would had a program and a place to put PV, say, we could have actually gotten the building to much closer to being net zero than we did.
so outside of the seismic retrofit and sustainability portions of this project, um, obviously a 100-year-old building, it's got some existing finishes that are incredible already. There were some other interior design features and renovations that you did. So tell me a little bit about some of those more notable things that you did in that arena with the interiors there and new things you added or did with the interiors. Because you can't just go slap some gypboard on the wall,
Right.
in a project like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, the predominant, uh, materials within the inside of the building, marble is definitely one of them. There are actually, I believe, 3 types of marble. They're building a new Supreme Court building in for the state back in 1912, 1913. They're thinking big, like, they're not sparing expense necessarily. So, um, predominantly, the floors are Alaska marble. The wall bases are a darker, like verde marble, darker green marble, and then all the walls and wainscoting through the building are is actually marble from Vermont. So just, sourcing these, you know, put it on a train, ship it across the country. Um, there's also quite a bit of mahogany, a lot of the wall paneling in the justice chambers, wood trim work in various places in the building, is some really nice mahogany, um, and then, ornamental plaster mostly at the ceiling level. So as far as rehab, a lot of these materials were preserved in place. Some of them, particularly the wood paneling, had to be demounted, l you know, labeled, stored, and then reinstalled, but we removed and reinstalled the vast majority just to minimize the amount of material that we would need to source new. Really, I think maybe the crowning feature in the interior of the building, is at the top of the, uh, court chamber, is a Povey Brothers ley light. And the Povey Brothers, if you're not familiar, were a renowned stained glass, manufacturer, and they actually were based right here in the Willamette Valley. They were referred to by some as the Tiffany of the West, I believe, is what they were called. If you're not familiar with the term ley light, it's essentially a skylight, but it's not a skylight that is exposed to the elements because the stained glass, horizontal stained glass laid in horizontally or in a shallow vault can't really, be exposed to the weather. So there is actually a clear skylight at the roof level above the Supreme Court chamber, and then an attic space, and then at the ceiling level of the Supreme Court chamber is this what we refer to as a ley light. So that light shines through the skylight, through the attic space, and it actually still illuminates the ceiling. So, it's a really important, notable architectural feature of the building. And for anybody who's seen the Supreme Court room, it's a very dominant feature as well.
So I'm gonna go off the rails for a minute here, because that happens. You say something, I wanna know more. So with some of these, materials, like the mahogany wall paneling, or that glass, the stained glass feature in the ceiling, um, oftentimes we have to remove those and store them, like you said, and then put them back in, but in old buildings, usually there's, at least for some of it, a piece of stained glass missing or damaged wall paneling or something, maybe chipped marble that you might have to replace. Did you, did you run into any issues related to that? Like finding the right, you can't, again, you can't just especially marble, like
Mm.
all these years later, if you have to do some more marble, could you find what you needed? Or did you have to get specialists involved to refinish some of that mahogany? What did you have to do anything special like that with any of that?
We did. The the marble, as often is the case with projects of this age, the stone, the quarry that the stone came from is no longer active. Like that's a very common challenge. And in the case of the Supreme Court, we had to go and because we did need replacement marble, particularly in the restrooms, which were clad with marble, just like the stairway in public lobbies. Um, we did need um, supplemental marble, and we went through a lot of iterations of trying to find marble and getting samples in and laying them out there in the field and looking at them and um, to figure out which one or ones would be the best replacement. When you can't match it, you at least try and get as close as you can. Um, the type of marble that is in the Supreme Court building is pretty heavily veined marble, and it's variable. So we couldn't just pick one marble type to patch in. We had to get a variety of them and determine for a certain location in the building which marble would actually be the best match for that and which marble would be the best match over here. So it was a it was a bit of a painstaking process, but that's what's required when you can't go to the source anymore. Um, Fortunately, the ley light did not have to come out. It was retained in place. But I like to joke that so the top of it is in the attic space. It had such an accumulation of dust across the entire top of it that literally simply was just carefully vacuumed off, essentially. I like to joke that, we should have gotten a lead point just for like the amount of increased light that was coming through that after we got all the grime and dust clear out of it.
So you mentioned plaster,
Mhm.
and I intentionally asked you just to only mention it for that question because there's a really great story that goes along with this plaster. So, two halves to this question. Tell me a little bit about what you did with the plaster, and then tell me this story.
Okay. Yeah, so even though um, the project required a fair amount of removal of plaster ornamentation, it also required some casting of new plaster ornamentation. So um, we followed a pretty typical process of creating molds of existing plaster elements, like a bracket, say at the edge of the ceiling and wall connection, and then those new pieces were cast into those molds and then reinstalled in the building. There's a challenge in the preservation world that the skilled artisans and skilled tradespeople who work with historic features like terracotta and plaster and to some degrees carved stone, their numbers are dwindling, and they have been for decades. And so at the beginning of this project, the Plasters Union in this area is Plasters Local 82. And at the beginning of the project, I forget the numbers. There were 60 some skilled plasters in the entire state of Oregon, and there were many that were needed for this project because of the amount of plaster work that happened. So this really great thing happened where our contractor Hoffman Construction partnered with the union and the plaster sub, and they basically used the project as an apprenticeship program to increase to train and increase the number of skilled plasterers in the state. And I think a really great success story for the project is that um, the number of skilled plasterers in the state almost doubled over the course of this apprenticeship program and the project. And I think that really bodes well for preservation moving forward because um, if these trades are allowed to, these artisans are allowed to um, disappear, the skills are allowed to disappear, then we're really in a bad spot when it comes to preserving this architectural heritage that we have.
I have to say, when you first mentioned that to me, I just think that's the most fantastic way to work at solving a problem that I don't know. I've never heard of anybody like, pivoting, like, okay, we need more plasterers. Let's use this project to train more. We had a Portland CSI meeting at the Plasterers Union here
Okay.
one time, and there are pictures of me in a dress and heels, which is ridiculous. That's not what I should have worn to that meeting
Mm.
because we went out to the union and we got our hands dirty and mixed the plaster and poured a mold, and they showed us all these different things they do, and it's you these are artisans. I
They
mean,
are.
this is not mine looked horrible, just trying it actually, it didn't come out too bad considering it was my first time, but I don't think that people really understand what that takes, and as we have pushed our young people harder and harder to go to college and learn about computers or science or whatever, even if it's not the right fit for that particular young person, I remember we used to do schools in my first firm. And I remember when they started taking all the auto shops and everything out of the schools or anything you did with the wood shops, all of that, and putting in computer labs. And I said way back then, that's a mistake. Not everybody's going to be on the college path, and who's going to build our buildings? And look where we are.
Yep.
So I really wanted you to talk about that because I'm hoping some listeners will go, wow, maybe we could do something with one of our projects to help elevate this tremendous lack of skilled trades that we have across all kinds of work on our buildings. So thank you for sharing that.
And of course.
From a design perspective, what would you say was the most difficult challenge to work out in this particular building's design, and how did you navigate it?
Yeah. Well, I think the design challenge of the project was how to protect the building from a future seismic event without destroying the building or the things that make the building special in the process. And that's where I think the conversation about this election to go to a base isolated system really comes into play. And in this building, a fixed base solution would have meant um, some pretty massive shear walls to get constructed up through the building to the roof. And there's there aren't great places to do that because most of the spaces are primary importance. One of the things we do at the outset of a project like this is to map out what we call the integrity zones. So, there's three. Zone one is restoration. Zone two is rehabilitation, which means maybe these aren't the most primary historic spaces, or maybe they are important spaces, but they've had some um, alterations done to them that maybe aren't reversible. And then zone three, which is we call renovation, which are sort of these behind, off the corridor, whatever. It's either it's never been an important historic space, or it's been so changed that there's no really hope for it. Um, so there's a lot of zone one and zone two spaces in this building. And a lot of that is because of the finishes that we talked about before. So to have removed enough of these finishes to make way for these massive shear walls, and then just the 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 size of the shear walls themselves would have meant removing the vast majority of historic fabric from inside this building. So then you're preserving the building for what? You're sort of you're reconstructing the inside of it, right? So that's where the base isolation really was fantastic because it limited the forces um, that the building will experience in the earthquake by so much that we just had to do some much more limited sort of lateral bracing, some shear walls at near the corners, which we were able to deal with, but nothing on the scale that would have been the case. So that upfront that pre-design time that we talked about was really spent understanding the building, mapping out alternatives, and then convincing ourselves that the best thing for the building was to jump in with both feet and do this base isolation.
Well, good thing you did that because it's a beautiful building and it would have I don't know, maybe I've got a soft heart, but you you have this you develop a relationship with spaces that have been a part of the fabric of your life your whole life. And I am always so disappointed to hear when something gets torn it down. It's like, no, that can't go away. That has or they go and just destroy it in a renovation process. There's just something about the history of it that gets lost that's kind of sad. So I'm glad you found that solution. Um, construction. Okay, the best construction stories I ever hear are on these old historic buildings. I did an interview on the Trinity Church in New York. They
Ooh,
had a list of them, things they found, artifacts they found inside walls, because it was one that had been messed with a lot of times over the years, and it was super old. I forgot how many years, but like 150 years old, the East Coast. There's always a good story during construction, no matter the project, but the old buildings get a little special. Did you, tell me about the construction phase and share with me at least one construction challenge or surprise that you encountered, that you had to kinda deal with in the moment?
just to ground us in like what it meant to do this structural project. You have to essentially um, build temporary foundation supports outside of the footprint of the existing columns that all came down into the base through the basement and into the foundation. You have to basically build a new support for the building that's going to hold it for months. Then you have to demolish the basement columns, all the foundations, and then install what I think was in the order of about a 4-foot thick mat foundation. So it's this heavily reinforced 4-foot thick concrete pad that that extended the entire footprint of the building, and then set these base isolators in place that support the ground floor, and then remove all the temporary supports that have been holding the building for the last, I don't know, year or plus. And the thing that I think amazed me the most about it was I believe that the tolerance for movement with transferring the loads of the building to the temporary supports and then transferring the load of the building back onto the new base isolators was an eighth of an inch. So that was I mean, that is the challenge. Like I don't know, and I think like it was a known challenge, but just to have been a witness to um, what sort of infrastructure, what sort of planning that it took to achieve that. Because if it moves more than an eighth of an inch, if it moves differentially, then things rack inside, up above, and things start to pop off the wall or get crushed. So it had to just remain as level and square as it possibly could. All the while there was this massive, new foundation project going on underneath it. So I've got lots of stories about like things we discovered in historic buildings that are really fun and interesting, but like I think the headline here is um, this building was basically, the foundation was demolished out from under it and a new one built. And the building basically had to remain exactly where it was.
That's an eighth of an inch. That's insane. The
And I
building
could
wa
be
it
wrong,
was
but
closed, right?
it was a fraction of an inch, maybe it, but I believe it was an eighth.
Yeah. I don't care if it's an inch. That's insane. Um, Building was closed for the project, right? It wasn't
Absolutely.
you didn't have to keep operations. That's a good thing.
Mhm.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. I did not realize when I was reading through there that you had to go through that to get to I don't know how you do that. That I would be stressed if I was Kaufman.
I think there were some nervy weeks and months in there, yeah.
So what would you say I feel like I learn something from every project I do. I have yet to do a project that didn't teach me something in one way or another. What would you say your biggest lesson learned was from this project that makes you an even better architect on the next one?
I I think it would probably have to be, like, it was a really good lesson for me in thinking big, 'cause it's a lot of times with historic preservation work, you're trying to do these light touches, right? You're trying to fix a thing by doing this really simple little intervention, and I think zooming out, I think it seemed a little bit crazy at the time to contemplate doing a base isolation for this particular building, but I guess the lesson is sort of, don't rule out options that's just because they seem unrealistic at from the jump. Like, really study it and, you know, try and be bold, right? If we hadn't gone there, if we hadn't been in that headspace, I don't we we may not have wound up with the same result that we did, but I think it was absolutely the right, um, solution for this particular building, even though it seemed audacious at the time. So
Well,
think big.
yeah, that's a really good point too, because you're right. You're looking for the lightest touches possible to, maintain that history and that fabric of what that building its own personality that has become over the years. And I don't know that a lot of people really even consider taking that path. Is there something big I can do and still maintain that and achieve what I need to achieve? That's a great lesson.
And we benefited from the fact that the basement space, which got completely obliterated. I mean, like, you have to get in your mind, you have to get to we're just totally eliminating this whole part of the building. But fortunately, in this case, the basement was there was nothing of consequence down there. It went away. It got totally rebuilt, and I don't think I don't think the building is fundamentally different for that having been done. So
Well, that's
that was,
lucky.
yeah, it was
We all
lucky.
know how everybody wants to be hoarders in a basement. So I've been really fortunate to have your firm on twice already. First one I believe was a PDX Airport Concourse E extension project, which was a great interview. And then I talked to your team over in Montana about the Bozeman Food Co-op project. Also a great project, great interview. Before we get to our 2 closing questions, tell me, what is Hennebery Eddy working on now? Because obviously, I like talking to you, so I'm gonna be coming back and saying, "Okay, I wanna hear about this one." What do you celebrate your firm a little bit. Tell me what you're working on now that we can all look forward to hearing about later.
Yeah, I'd love to. I had the distinct privilege of spending the last roughly 8 years, while I wasn't working on the Oregon Supreme Court, um, leading a multidisciplinary team in the design of the Rothko Pavilion for the Portland Art Museum, and that just opened in just before Thanksgiving, late last year, and so it's not work on the boards, but it's something that we were, you know, in progress with for 8 years, and it's been really fun to see how it's been received by the public. And um, there will be. I'm really excited to see, like, when summertime comes in Portland, and people start really coming out downtown. It's just going to be such a vibey heartbeat of downtown Portland, I believe, and I really hope that it just like kickstarts some other things in that kind of cultural district around there. As far as stuff on the boards in progress, we're working on an expansion of the Redmond Airport, which serves Bend in Central Oregon. Um, we're in construction on a new school of computing at Montana State University, which is an all mass timber building. We're just wrapping up a new campus, a new public works campus for the city of Bend. Out of our Bend, these are out of our Bozeman studio, the MSU project, and our Bend studio for that public works campus. And then we're doing quite a bit of work for the National Park Service, as we have over the years. And I think one of the notable ones we're doing right now is down at Petrified Forest in Arizona. There's a Richard Neutra designed painted desert complex, which is sort of the park headquarters complex. So we're doing some historic rehabilitation work on that very important historic group of buildings down at Petrified Forest. And then finally, we're in construction on historic rehabilitation of a building at University of Washington in Seattle, their Anderson Hall, which is the home of their School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. So lots of good, some historic stuff, some aviation stuff, things happening across all three of our studios.
Well, it's really I learned in 2008 when the economy went belly up and my firm closed. It's a really bad idea to have all your eggs in one basket in this industry. And we did schools. We were known for it. We were like always in the top 3 on every short list for every school project in Oregon. Um, but when the economy goes bad, they don't pass bond issues. And you don't have work. And so I remember the lesson learned from all of that is do not pigeonhole yourself into one project type. I mean, it's great to become the expert, so to speak, but it doesn't do very well if that particular project type work slows down. And it's not as much fun. I mean, I learned so much from doing public work for years. It was insane, but it also gets a little boring after a while. There's only so
Hmm.
many things you're going to do with a school.
Right.
Um, And so, well, I there's not a one of those projects I wouldn't wanna talk about, so I guess you guys are gonna be hanging out with me a lot. So we always close the episode with 2 questions, one a more broad industry question, and then our final question that I make everybody answer. So, I've worked on historic projects in the past, as I've mentioned, and they can be challenging and time-consuming, and all kinds of surprises can show up. And it can also be stressful if they are particularly high-profile buildings, because the public is so, invested emotionally in a lot of those buildings.
Hmm.
What what can you offer the rest of us best practices in approach and planning to ensure success in this type of project and and support for what you're about to do to that building everybody's so emotionally attached to?
Yeah, I I I gave this one some thought, because I think it's an important one. I think it starts with building a talented team of people across all your disciplines, and building a team that has historic experience. I don't think there's a lot of good substitutes for having done historic work. Um, just having the sensitivity to know what's what, and what might be a good idea, and what probably is going to be a bad idea for the building. Um, as I talked about before, invest in the upfront planning and investigation. It will pay dividends down the road for sure. Um, we didn't come up with the integrity zones mapping that I talked about, zones 1 through 3, but we use it a lot. And I would encourage others who are doing historic projects to take the time to create a color-coded floor plans of each floor of the building and the exterior elevations, and determine amongst the team and the client what are the most important spaces, what are the spaces where you've got some flexibility, and what are the spaces where you really can do that heavy lift of new program and reconfiguration where you need to. Those early discussions with the building officials and state historic preservation offices and whoever else has the agency in the project, and then pick the right contractor. And again, contractor that has done historic work, because there's it's tough to fake it till you make it with with historic projects. You got to have somebody that's got a level of sophistication uh, and knows how to treat these really important places and buildings.
All good advice. Great advice. So, final question. Uh, I hope we all hope to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution to make the world a better place. Um, I think it's the only way we really move forward. Personal or professional, big or small, what do you hope your impact will be?
I think that our built environment, this is going to be mostly professional, but a little personal. Our built environment, I think, is to me is one of the best ways that we convey our cultural heritage, our past. And they're one of the most visible ways, right? Like art does that. There's other media that do that. I think everybody who moves around in a city or a town is constantly passing buildings, and I think those buildings they represent so much, each one of them. Um, and so I think I get a lot of fulfillment. I think a lot of architects get fulfillment out of creating the new thing, and I get that, and I get some fulfillment out of doing that. But for me, it's if my work can breathe new life into a historic resource, give it a new use that will keep it viable for another couple of generations, or seismically retrofit it so that it actually still is standing, to be able to be that link to the past and to be able to tell the stories, or at least be the genesis of its own, of the stories that it has to tell. Like, I think for me, that's what that's what got me hooked, way back in my Chicago days with the Burnham Plan. And I think it's really what's propelled me professionally, is knowing that there's a lot more buildings that are consequential to someone. It doesn't matter who, there's to someone or some group that will live on much, much longer as a result of the work that I've done. So that's what keeps me getting up every morning and putting on my historical architect hat.
Well, I really love that answer because, I interview a lot of architects and I get a lot of, I want to create buildings that people feel comfortable in or that make them feel good. But that's a little bit different twist. I mean, I think about it when I'm traveling. I do a fair amount of traveling for different things that I do. One of the first things I want to go see is the history of that city.
It-
Whether it's, going to the top of the Empire State Building when I was in New York or going into St. Peter's when I was in Italy. I know that I often gravitate towards what got that city to where it is now, not the new shiny building downtown unless it's some kinda crazy Starchitect thing. I don't It's cool to go by it. "Oh, that pretty building." Um, but that's often not what I'm searching out, and nothing breaks my heart more than to see that place somewhere that it's built into the personality of a city, and that shouldn't go away, and if you can, restore it make it safe. And even if it's operating under another use, there's a sense of history you feel every time you walk in, a sense of ownership, a sense of belonging. And that's, to me, that's huge. Big or small. I've been into theaters that were once these grand
The fifth.
whatever with the red velvet curtains and the box seats and all of that have been turned into like a more current concert venue, but they've maintained some of that history. Um, and you feel like you're walking into a different era, a different time. You can almost feel the stories that have gone through that building over the years.
And
So I really respect that. And, I can't remember the last time I talked to an architect that focused on historic work. I think like we're losing skilled labor. I think that there are a lot of architects that don't always find that to be the most enjoyable because it is difficult work.
yeah, I think that's true, and we need all types, I think. But more and more, we're just an environmental standpoint, we're not going to be able to continue building more and tearing down and replacing. We're going to have to work harder to find how to fit new uses into existing buildings. Like our planet can't take much more of what we've been doing, and we're headed in the right direction. And I think just focusing on existing buildings and the benefit that the huge resource that they already are, um, is a sort of a virtuous path for
Well,
us
I
to.
will say I
So,
have interviewed quite a few architects about adaptive reuse projects. And some in some crazy situations. You're like, how did you turn that literally concrete shell into this beautiful facility? There was one in New York like that, and it just like it was empty concrete. It was some kind of sewage plant or something way back in the day that had been a place for vandals to hang out and no roof on it. And now it's this great art center. Um, Definitely that's on the rise, insanely on the rise. But that's not always necessarily preserving that history. It's taking what's left of what's there and making something new out of it. And so I kind of see the two as two different things, but both equally as important.
mhm.
Because we're not going to be able to preserve every building. You may not even really want to. But you can still use what's there and save the planet a whole lot of grief
Right,
than
exactly.
starting over.
Well, and when we do design new buildings, because we do, I mean, it happens, it's needed. Um, it I think an interesting way to think about it is 50, 60, 75 years from now, this building may be a historic building. What do we wanna take into account now? If we're building it to be resilient and we're building it to last, what are the what are they going to deem as the character defining features of this building that we're designing now? It's this continuum that I think, um, we're thinking about now, but I'm not sure that we were thinking about 20 years ago, um,
I don't
designing the next historic buildings.
I've never ever heard anybody say that out loud in front of me. I mean, I've heard people talk about future proofing as far as like systems and
Again.
how can we put in like IT systems or MEP or those kinds of things in this building to make it last longer before those have to be replaced.
Right.
But actually thinking about what are people gonna think when they look at this building 75 years from now? What do we want them to think, or what do we want them to see, or are we thinking about the materials that are gonna last
And
75 years or be notable? That's not a conversation people are having, but it's a crazy important conversation that should be happening for the new buildings, is really looking at longevity, not we all know there's budgets and schedules, so what can I build in within this budget, but am I making all the best choices?
mhm, and is what I'm doing clear? Is there clarity to it to where someone 75 years from now is going to understand what this building is about and what its important features are? I think that's we've been talking about it here at Hennebery Eddy for a while, and I think it helps. It's part of the design process that helps us to get that clarity that we're seeking in our design work on new buildings. So it's fun. It's fun to think about.
Well, hopefully after this interview, a whole lot more people will go, there's a thought process maybe I don't always have on a new building. Maybe I'll be thinking about it. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me today. Great conversation, great building. I promise next time I'm in Salem, I'm going to go take a look.
Yeah,
And I love that once in a while I actually get to interview somebody that where I can actually go see the project.
I know, right?
That those pods on the side of the cliff in Argentina, I don't know if I'm gonna make it there, although I would do that too, but, I really appreciate you taking the time to share this project with me today, and know that my door is always open. So you don't have to wait for an invite if you have a great project, coming up you wanna talk about, just drop me a line.
All right, Cherise. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.